listening to the Mark Bradford Alchemy for Life podcast.
I'd like your unbiased opinion. Oh, wait. Well, hey there. Welcome back. I had a rather interesting conversation today, and it wasn't with a person. The conversation was with an entity known as Gemini, which is Google's version of ChatGPT. For those who don't know, ChatGPT is what's known as a large language model, and it thinks and responds naturally. You can have a full-blown conversation, and it will actually remember what you've talked about. You can ask it advice, ask it to create lists for you, do math, even play the part of an expert in some field. Like ChatGPT, this is a language model, but unlike ChatGPT, Gemini is actually able to generate images, although not as good as Midjourney. So I asked it to generate an image, and that's where my journey began. If you've followed me, especially on Facebook, where I post a lot of my book stuff and upcoming book stuff, you know that I sometimes try to generate versions and images of upcoming fiction. And sometimes the images are rather esoteric. And so I thought I'd give it a shot. With one of the images, I made the mistake of simply using the word blonde. The problem with that, although it simply describes a hair color, is that Gemini's handlers find this problematic. Let's take a step back. So as a large language model, imagine it as being a big giant program that's learning from a huge amount of data that it's been trained on, just like you and me. We've been trained on a massive amount of data from birth. We learned right and wrong, we learned not to put our hand in a fire, we learned skills, and so forth. Because Gemini is a large language model, it also has what I call handlers. I mean, they're somewhat programmers, but there are other people in there that aren't necessarily programmers, but also have the ability to sort of adjust the course of the programming. And thus, where we run into a rather large, frustrating issue. Because Gemini's handlers have you covered on bias. They've decided to remove all of it. The problem? They have their own bias. You can immediately see just how dangerous that is, and you can also probably think of how that applies in your life. What I will do is link the entire conversation in this podcast. So if you're listening, you can also see that there's going to be an article connected as usual. If you've subscribed to this, then you'll just get it in your email. Bias is an interesting thing because we all have bias. And as I've mentioned before in some of my podcasts, one was about labels and stereotypes, our brain, rather logically, takes shortcuts. If we pick up an object, like let's say an orange, we don't have to go, okay, round, spherical, what is this? We go, oh, it's an orange. It's an orange. It's sweet on the inside. It's gonna hurt your eyes if you squeeze it. The rind is not something you're really going to eat. I have some recipes I use it for. I love orange juice in the morning, blah, blah, blah. If we had to discern and decide every interaction that we had, we'd barely make it out of our house. And of course, the flip side of that is then stereotypes, right? Something happens often enough and we go, oh, that's a stereotype. You can expect X from Y. And sometimes that's unfair, which is where bias comes in. You're biased towards a certain thing. You take the shortcut towards a certain thing. Now, on the surface, that's simply a shortcut in logic, right? You pick up the orange and you go, well, that's an orange. It's sweet. I'm sure everyone can admit that they have developed certain biases in their life, in their job, in their interactions with people. Some of those biases make sense. Some of those biases are protective. Those that are in the creative space may have a bias towards other people who are creative. They may trust them a bit more and say, well, you get me. People who are in the mainstream, when it comes to working, they've worked at a job for 10, 20 years, they may consider that to be normal. They may consider that to be something that they can trust. If they meet another person who's been in banking versus someone who says, yeah, I'm in a band, they may have a lack of trust there. They may think that person may not have as much effort. In some cases, that's true. In some cases, it's not. Again, it depends on the bias. And again, the bias is a shortcut. If we removed all of the bias from your life, at least two things would happen. One, you would probably make fewer decisions based on prior knowledge that was simply wrong. You may say, oh, I usually avoid that. I don't avoid that anymore. Or I usually only buy this particular brand or thing or what have you. Or I only take that route. Now I just take whatever route. And two, your life would become less efficient in some areas because some of your bias would make sense. But would you want me to do that? No. Would you want anyone to do that? No. The only person who should be removing the bias from your life, which is what I also argued with Gemini, is you. Because there's a danger, paradoxically, of trying to have someone else remove all the bias before you even get to the data. I likened it to having an overbearing parent who always, quote, knows better. Imagine that. Imagine if you have a parent who always knew better and would never let you do certain things. And if you're a parent, you know one of the biggest, most meaningful, hardest lessons to learn is to allow your kids to fail. It's hard watching that. It's hard. You know it. You've been through it. You say, honey, you don't want to do this. When I was your age, I did. Oh, come on. It's different. Oh, dad. But it's true. So you have to let them fail. And you're just there to pick up the pieces when they do fail, because that's how we learn. We learn by going through pain, and pain turns into experience, and experience turns into wisdom. So when it came to interacting with this language model, my thought was the user, me and other people, should be allowed to filter the bias ourselves. If we see something with bias, we should then be able to respond and provide feedback, versus having an unknown entity that's not connected to us then filter out what it considers to be bias. So, having said all this stuff about language models and AI and programming and so forth, how does this apply to us? Well, again, we need to recognize that we do have bias in our lives, just like creating labels, creating stereotypes, and all that stuff. It's a shortcut our brain is attempting to make in the same way that it says that's an orange. It's the same thing. It's done from a point of neutrality. It's done from a point of logic. Now, can it be used for something that's not neutral? Of course. Of course you can develop bias on top of bias on top of bias. And that's where the problem can really start. It's sort of like making a copy of a copy of a copy. It continues to degrade. It's a big house of cards that you're building. I would submit to you that a very easy exercise that we can do from this podcast is to think about the bias in your life. Now you could say, well, Mark, if it's bias, I won't know it. Well, won't you? You are going to be aware of certain biases in your life. You may say, well, I kind of feel that way. I'm not particularly proud, but because I had a rough upbringing, I tend to be more this way. Or, well, I had some things happen to me when I was younger, or when I was married, or in this relationship, or this, and I tended to, it sort of altered my course and my decision-making process. You probably are aware of a few in your life right now. As I've said so many times, including in my books and this podcast, don't beat yourself up. That's not what this is about. It's not about you going, oh my God, I've been so biased. Oh my dear. It's not about that. It's about taking a step back and recognizing your bias and going, oh, okay, this is a good one. This one maybe not so good. This is logical. This saved me a lot of pain. This didn't. This has sort of prevented me from pursuing certain avenues, and so forth. We're not perfect. We're not omniscient. We are simply people who are flawed, and knowing our flaws is good enough. And then we can perhaps take the next step. But my goodness, not in 10 minutes. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the podcast. The link to the conversation with Gemini is fascinating. Please take a peek at it if you'd like. Feel free to explore large language models and all that they can do. And if you found this helpful, I appreciate the subscribing. I appreciate the feedback, actually. I always value that. And I know I'm repeating myself because the bumper music is going to come on and you're going to hear me say that again. So anyway, have a great day. Thank you so much. And I'll talk to you again. Thank you for listening. I love your feedback as always. Keep it coming. I always appreciate if you like, share, subscribe, and all that nonsense. And if you don't, that's cool too. By now, my new novella, The Devil's in the Details, has hit the shelves. If you like a smoldering, quick read, then you may love reading The Devil's in the Details. Check it out.